At 3:17 in the morning, the sirens woke me. I already knew. I had always known. For 6 years, I watched through my window. I saw the bruises she tried to hide. I heard his voice cut through the walls like a blade. And every single time I looked away, they said she fell, 7 months pregnant, at the bottom of a marble staircase. And the man who pushed her? He was already on the phone with 911, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly practiced, the devoted husband, the grieving father-to-be. I watched him perform from my darkened bedroom, and I said absolutely nothing. But then her sister arrived, and everything I had buried for 6 years, every excuse, every turned back, every pulled curtain came crashing down on me, because I wasn't just a coward. I was his accomplice. I had a security camera. I had photos. I had years of evidence sitting in my silence. The question was, would I be silent one more time? Or would I finally become the person Meredith needed me to be 6 years too late? Cruel men build their power on the silence of the people around them. The moment one person decides to speak, his entire kingdom starts to fall. If this story hit you somewhere deep, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week we tell the stories of women who refused to stay silent and the people who finally chose to stand with them.
I remember hearing the ambulance that morning at 3:17. It was a call I'd been dreading for years. I had a vision of Meredith as a little girl, before him, chasing butterflies in the sunlit yard next door. The sirens wailed again. I saw the flashing lights paint my bedroom walls red and blue. My hand shook as I pulled back the curtain. The screen of my own phone was dark in my silent Seattle home, a stark contrast to the chaos next door. Hartford Memorial Hospital. The words on the ambulance were a death sentence. A paramedic's voice cut through the air, professional and calm. The kind of voice that has to announce the end of a world. I heard them say her name, Meredith Ashford. My heart hammered against my chest. I sat up, my own sheets tangling around my legs. The cold night air a slap in the face. What did he do? A heavy silence settled after they loaded her in, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. I knew there was an accident, but I knew it was no accident. She was in intensive care. The word fell, echoed from a police radio, a lie hanging in the humid air. I never believed it. I heard a medic say she was in a coma, a brain injury, and also 7 months pregnant. The baby was alive, for now, and she needed someone. I watched the house all night, knowing I should have been her emergency contact, should have been her friend, 7 months. I didn't know she was pregnant. I hadn't dared to speak to her in years, not since he made it clear neighbors weren't welcome, not since he built a wall of silence around that house. I will not be silent anymore, I whispered to myself. I stayed there in the darkness, the rain blurring the streetlights into long, weeping streaks. My normal life felt like a fraud, a flimsy cover for the horror I had ignored next door. My world had cracked right open. I watched the sun rise, and then I saw a car pull up. It wasn't the police, it was her sister, Sloan. Far away from me, just 12 hours before, Meredith Ashford was in her kitchen. I could see the lights on from my window. A chef's kitchen for a woman who was never allowed to have guests. I saw her silhouette at the stove, her posture weary. Her body was swollen, changed by 7 months of carrying a child. I saw his car pull in. The sound of the garage door was a rumble of thunder before a storm. The slam of his Mercedes door was a gunshot in the quiet night. I saw her posture stiffen through the window. Grant's steps were always heavy, angry. I learned to recognize their rhythm from my yard. A slow, heavy tread meant she was in danger. Tonight the sound was a death march. I heard his voice, a cold blade of a sound. It always made my own stomach twist in sympathy. She turned to face him, a small bird facing a hawk. Grant Ashford, 40 years old, a man stitched together from expensive suits and inherited cruelty. The man she married 8 years ago, who then began to systematically take her apart, piece by piece. His eyes, even from a distance, looked like hot coals. He reeked of whiskey. I could smell it when the wind shifted. "How was your day?" she must have asked, her voice a tightrope walk. I'd seen her practice that steadiness 100 times. He crossed that kitchen in 3 long strides. I saw him grab her. He squeezed her wrist until she flinched. "Don't you dare pretend," his voice carried across the lawn. "Grant, stop it. You're hurting me." "Good," he snarled. His words were poison darts. "I saw you with Theo." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. Just talking." He called his own brother a fool. His grip got tighter. "What did you tell him about me?" "Nothing, I swear." "Please, the baby." For a second, I thought he'd let her go. I saw a flicker of something in his stance, a brief pause. I hoped some piece of him was still human. I was a fool to hope. The first strike was so fast, I almost missed it. Her head snapped back. I saw her stumble, saw the dark bloom of blood on her lip. "You think I'm an idiot?" he roared. He let go of her wrist, and she fell back against the counter. "You think I don't see you turning my own family against me?" "I never did, Grant, please." The second hit was a fist. It sent her reeling. The world must have spun for her. She barely caught herself on the counter's edge. "I gave you all this." His voice cracked with rage, the careful mask slipping off. "This house, this life, and this is my reward?" I saw Meredith's hand go to her belly, a desperate protective instinct. She had to save her baby. She had to run. She bolted from the kitchen, a blur of motion toward the front of the house. If she could just get out the door, if she could just get to her car. He caught her at the base of the grand staircase. His hand shot out like a snake, clamping around her arm. He spun her around. His eyes were empty, hollowed out by pure rage. "Where are you going? Please, I'm sorry, whatever I did." "You're always sorry." His laugh was the sound of breaking glass. It was a cold, empty noise that drifted into my yard. "You're pathetic. Absolutely pathetic." Then he pushed her. It wasn't a hard shove. Grant was always precise, always careful to leave marks that could be explained away as a clumsy accident, a fall, a misstep. But she was at the top of a marble staircase. This time, she tumbled. The fall was a horrifying dance of broken limbs. Her shoulder hit the banister. Her hip slammed against a step. She tried to curl around her belly, to shield her child, but it was hopeless. She fell and fell and fell until she landed in a heap on the marble floor below. The pain must have been blinding, absolute. She couldn't move, just stare at the cold crystal chandelier dripping light from the ceiling. So pristine, so cruel. I saw his face appear over her, his expression shifting from rage to cold calculation, and finally, to feigned concern. It was like watching an actor change masks. "Look what you did," he said, his voice now gentle, a twisted parody of care. "You need to be more careful on the stairs." I saw Meredith try to answer, try to scream, but a darkness was pulling her under, stealing the light from the world. The last thing I heard before I ran inside and locked my own door was Grant's smooth, practiced voice on the phone with 911. "My wife." She fell down the stairs. "Please, you have to hurry. She's pregnant." Then there was entire silence. Sloan arrived at the airport at 7:45 the next morning. I watched her rental car drive past my house. She hadn't slept. You could see it in the hard set of her jaw. She had spent her flight thinking about Grant Ashford, about the cold dread she must have felt when Meredith first introduced them. Meredith met him at some fancy charity event. She was just 24 then, working at a center for abused women, fresh from college. The irony is so thick, it chokes you. Grant was 32, already the king of his family's empire, a man who measured the world in dollars. He wooed her with roses and private jets, promising a perfect life. But her sister saw the predator behind the smile. Sloan was an accountant, someone who knew how to spot the lies hidden in the numbers, and she saw the lie in him. He looked at Meredith, not with love, but with the pride of a collector. Sloan pulled up in a gray, forgettable car. She drove through our perfect town, past the white picket fences and blazing autumn leaves. It's a beautiful place, a postcard town, the kind of place where you can hide murder behind a charming smile. Hartford Memorial rose up like a fortress, and I knew I couldn't stay in mine any longer. I walked out my door, something small and heavy in my pocket. The phone I saw him throw into the hedges, and I started walking toward her. It started like any other shift, with the hushed urgency of a new ICU admission. They told us she fell. A woman, pregnant, unconscious, with injuries that screamed louder than the official story. I remember her sister arriving later, a storm cloud of grief and resolve in our sterile hallway. She stood for a long moment, staring at the double doors, as if gathering the strength to walk through fire. I'd seen that look before. It's the look of someone who knows the truth is far worse than what's written on a chart. I directed her to the waiting area, my voice betraying none of the cold dread I felt coiling in my stomach. She was family. She deserved to know, but hospital rules are a fortress of their own. I saw him first, Mr. Grant Ashford, holding court in the family lounge. He wore an expensive suit, a mask of weary concern perfectly arranged on his handsome face. He was the picture of devotion, a man shattered by his wife's tragic accident. He stood when he saw the sister, Sloan, his voice a warm, rehearsed melody of sorrow. He spoke of reconciliation, of hopes and dreams, but his eyes were cold calculators, assessing a new threat on the board. I've worked this floor for a decade. I know the difference between real grief and a performance. His was flawless, and that's what scared me the most. He was playing a part, and I wondered just how long the show had been running before the curtain fell on his wife in our ICU. I was in the room when her sister finally saw her. The air caught in her throat. Our patient, Meredith, was a landscape of medical machinery, her body a canvas of bruises that a simple fall could never paint. A ventilator breathed for her, a quiet, rhythmic sigh that counted the seconds of her life. Her face was a swollen ruin. I watched the sister, Sloan, approach the bed as if in a trance, her every movement heavy with a grief that felt ancient. She took Meredith's hand, a small, fragile thing in her own, and a wave of unspoken history washed over the room, more potent than the smell of antiseptic. I busied myself checking the monitors, giving them the illusion of privacy, but I heard him, the husband, his voice a smooth overlay of false hope. I heard her tell him to leave, her voice a raw whisper that carried the weight of a command. After the door clicked shut, the silence was broken only by the machines. I watched her stand there, a silent sentinel by the bedside, her gaze fixed on the broken woman who was her sister. I saw her notice the fingernails, bitten down to the quick. It's a detail doctors sometimes miss, but nurses see everything. We see the little signs of a life lived in fear. My own guilt gnawed at me. How many times had I seen signs like this and said nothing, bound by procedure? I watched her spot the clear plastic bag on the bedside table, the one marked patient belongings, a life reduced to a phone and a wallet. Later, on my rounds, I saw the glow of a phone screen from the room. Sloan was hunched over it, her shoulders shaking. The phone screen was a spider web of cracks, a mirror of the woman in the bed. I didn't need to know her password was a birthday to understand the gravity of that moment. I saw the flash of horror on her face, the way her breath hitched. She had found something, something that confirmed the ugly truth I had suspected from the moment Meredith was wheeled through our doors. She looked from the phone to her sister's bruised face, connecting the digital words to the physical wounds, and I knew right then that the story of a simple fall was about to be torn apart. She put the phone away as if it were a sacred relic, a piece of evidence that could change everything. Her movements were deliberate, filled with a new, cold fury. She leaned down, her lips moving in a silent promise against her sister's forehead, a promise of justice. When she walked back into the waiting room, she was a different woman. The raw grief was still there, but now it was forged into something harder, sharper. I watched her sit across from Grant Ashford, her eyes never leaving him, a predator who had finally scented the weakness in her prey. I saw the fear flicker in his eyes for just a second before the mask of the worried husband snapped back into place. Dr. Thornton's arrival broke the tension. She had that look, the one doctors get when they have to deliver bad news wrapped in careful, clinical language. I stood nearby, pretending to update a chart, listening. Ashford played his part perfectly, his voice breaking on cue as he asked about his wife. The doctor's words were a dance of medical terminology. Medically induced coma? Significant swelling? 72 hours? All phrases meant to soften a brutal reality. Then she mentioned the baby, a tiny 7-month passenger in this tragedy, and the air grew heavier still. Grant nodded, playing the role of the generous provider, the concerned father-to-be. It was a masterful performance. "Cost is no object," he said, the words dripping with magnanimity. I had to fight the urge to roll my eyes. Dr. Thornton's gaze then shifted to Sloan. "You are?" she asked, though I saw the flicker of recognition. "Meredith's sister." The doctor's face was a careful, neutral mask, but her eyes said she understood. "Could I speak with you privately?" Grant tried to intervene, to control the narrative, but Dr. Thornton was firm. "Hospital policy," she said, a polite weapon against a man who was used to getting his way. As I watched her lead Sloan down the hall to the consultation room, I felt the first real spark of hope I'd felt all night. The fortress was starting to show some cracks. I couldn't hear what they said behind the closed door, but I didn't need to. I saw the way Sloan looked when she came out, pale, shaken, but with a fire in her eyes. I knew Dr. Thornton had confirmed her fears, had pointed out the older injuries, the patterns of abuse that we were forced to document in passive clinical terms. The official report would say consistent with a fall, but a sister knows the truth. I saw the bitterness in Sloan's face, the understanding that money and connections had protected this man for years. Men like him always seemed to slip through the cracks. But as I looked at Sloan's determined expression, I thought, maybe not this time. Maybe this time, someone was here to seal those cracks for good. I remember the first time I really saw it, 2 years ago. We were at lunch and Meredith laughed, a genuine, beautiful sound, and he grabbed her wrist under the table. Just a little too hard. The smile vanished. Her eyes darted around, terrified. That's when the excuses started. Always clumsy, always accidents. This was her third visit to my hospital in 2 years, and the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. I'd see him bring her in, his face a perfect mask of concern, and he'd always steer her away before I could get a moment alone with her. I tried once, asked if she felt safe. The fear in her eyes was an answer, but she whispered that everything was fine. Then he was there, and she fell silent. 3 times. 3 chances I had to do something, and I did nothing. I watched him build her cage, and I just stood by. I just let her protect him, right up until the end. "Thank you for coming," I should have said to the doctor, but the words wouldn't come out. I just hoped she would wake up, that things would be different this time. Then I saw her sister, Sloan, walk out of that consultation room, and for the first time in years, a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. I watched from the nurse's station as Grant approached her, his concerned husband act back in place. He was so smooth, so believable. I saw him walk with her toward Meredith's room, heard his sickeningly sweet voice talking about how much Meredith missed her, how he'd encouraged her to call. The man was a monster wearing a human suit, and I was one of the few who knew it. I stayed back, but I saw them stop in the hallway. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Sloan turn, her posture like steel. Her voice, even from a distance, had a cold, sharp edge. I watched Grant's face, that practiced, easy smile. But his eyes, I saw it. That flicker of something cold and dangerous, like a predator sizing up a new threat. My breath caught in my throat. He thought he had everyone fooled, that his story about a fall, a terrible accident, was enough. He thought the police closing the case meant it was over. But looking at Sloan, at the unwavering strength in her stance as she walked into that room without a second glance back, I knew the fight was just beginning. The hours that followed felt like holding my breath. I watched Sloan through the window in the door, saw her hold Meredith's hand, talking to her. I imagined she was telling her everything I never could, that she was strong, that she could fight this. I saw her as a warrior, finding the people who hide behind money and power, and I knew she was Meredith's only chance. Grant was untouchable, or so he thought. But Sloan was here now. I could see the promise she was making to her unconscious sister. I will find every secret, and I will make him pay. My hands were shaking, my eyes burning with unshed tears. It was time. After years of silence, of being a coward, I had to speak. I took a deep breath, clipped on my visitor badge, and knocked softly on the door. My voice was a wreck when I finally spoke, raw from hours of silent crying. "I'm so sorry. I'm Charlotte Reeves. Charlie, I'm a friend of Meredith's." When she said her name was Sloan, it was like a dam broke inside me. "Oh my God," I choked out. "She talked about you constantly. She missed you more than anything." Sloan just stood and offered me her own chair, a simple kindness that nearly broke me. I collapsed into it, taking Meredith's other hand. The tears wouldn't stop. "I should have done more," I whispered, the guilt eating me alive. I knew something wasn't right, but she always had a story, said she was clumsy. I didn't want to see it. "You couldn't have known," she said, "but I should have. I'm a nurse, I know the signs. I see this every day." But with her, he was so perfect, and she was so good at pretending. Sloan pulled a chair close. "Tell me everything," she said, and her voice was so steady it gave me strength. I looked at her, saw not just grief but a fierce determination, and it felt like hope. "Where do I even start?" I asked, and then the words just poured out. I told her how Grant had isolated Meredith, controlling her money, her schedule, even her friends, how he'd show up at our lunches, how he tracked her phone. I talked about the bruises she'd try to hide, the way she'd flinch if he moved too fast. I confessed about the night she showed up at my door, shaking and terrified, and made me swear I wouldn't tell. She said he would know, I explained, my voice cracking. She was convinced he knew everything. I told her about the one time she tried to leave, how he lured her back with tears and empty promises. She always went back. I took out my phone, my hands trembling as I showed Sloan the pictures. Meredith at parties, smiling, but I pointed out the things no one else saw. The tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never reached her eyes, the way she always angled herself away from him, a subtle, desperate attempt to create space. We all saw something was wrong, I admitted, the shame heavy in my voice. We just chose not to look too closely. Sloan stared at the photos, her face grim. She was building a case. I could see it. "I need your help," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I can't do this alone." I wiped my tears, my resolve hardening. "Anything, whatever it takes." That night, I went home and didn't sleep. I stayed up, digging through old messages, looking for anything I might have missed. His company was clean, a perfect corporate citizen on the surface, a philanthropist. But I remembered things Meredith had told me in passing, whispers about strange business deals, employees who were fired for asking too many questions. I recalled her mentioning some trouble with government contracts a while back, how it had all just disappeared. I started making a list, every detail, every name. Sloan was going after a man with unlimited resources and powerful connections, a man who could ruin people without a second thought. I thought about Meredith, lying in that hospital bed, her life hanging by a thread. I thought about the fear I'd seen in her eyes for years. He was going to kill her, and I was not going to stand by anymore. I forwarded everything I found to the private email Sloan had given me. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I had to go to her mother's funeral. I remember how awful it was. Elizabeth was a no-nonsense woman. She would have despised the spectacle Grant created. It was a performance, and Meredith was the star puppet. I stood in the back, watching Grant parade her around, his hand always on her, playing the part of the supportive husband. She was flawless in a designer dress and pearls, but her eyes were empty. She looked like a ghost. At one point, our eyes met across the crowded room, and I saw a flicker of the real Meredith, a desperate plea. Then Grant leaned in, whispered something, and the mask slipped right back into place. Later, I saw Sloan corner him in the study. I saw the look on her face, and I knew this was far from over. I still remember the first time I felt it, that cold knot in my stomach. It was at their summer barbecue. He flashed that movie star smile and asked, "Can I get you something? The bourbon is excellent." But I saw what he was. The smile never left his lips, but his eyes went hard when Meredith laughed a little too long at a joke my husband told. I knew. I asked her about a bruise on her arm later, and she just waved it off. Said she was clumsy. "You know me," she'd said. I saw the way he watched us, the way his hand tightened on her waist, pulling her back to his side. A little voice told me it was wrong, but I silenced it. It wasn't my place to interfere. That was the first lie I told myself. It wouldn't be the last. I chose to believe it was paranoia, that I was just being judgmental of the new neighbors. Meredith was my best friend. At least, she was before him. We used to have coffee every morning. Then it became once a week. Then, maybe next month. He'd said, "Meredith needs her rest." His voice so full of concern. The last time I was over, I saw her flinch when he came up behind her. Just a tiny, imperceptible shudder. But I saw it, and I said nothing. I'd hear them through the thin hedge between our yards sometimes. His voice was always a low murmur, but hers would get smaller and smaller until it disappeared. I would just turn up the television, not wanting to hear, not wanting to know. I told myself that all couples fight, that it was just a disagreement. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to make things awkward. What a coward I was. My God. The last time I really saw her, was at the grocery store. Her eyes were so empty. All the light that used to be there was just gone. I asked her if she was okay, and for a second, I thought the old Meredith was about to break through. Then he was there, appearing out of nowhere, his hand on her back. "We're fine," he'd said, smiling at me, but the smile never reached his eyes. just a little tired. And she just nodded, a perfect little doll. I see that moment in my nightmares, the plea in her eyes that I chose to ignore. I just said, "Well, take care of yourself," and walked away. The words echo in my head now, a constant reminder of how I failed her, how I let her walk away when she was screaming for help without ever making a sound. And now she's in a hospital bed, an accidental fall. I sit here in my kitchen, staring at the phone, replaying every single time. I looked away. 6 years of excuses. 6 years of telling myself it was their life, not mine. I didn't want to lose but the one friend I had left in her. But I'd already lost her, hadn't I? I lost her to him, piece by piece, and I stood by and watched it happen. He didn't just break her bones. He broke her spirit, convincing her that his world was the only one that was real. Abusers are masters of that. They isolate you until you can't trust your own mind. I know that now. I've spent the last few days reading everything I could, trying to understand how I could have been so blind. The articles all say the same thing. It's impossible to help someone who doesn't want it. But that call, the one she tried to make, that was her asking. After all this time, she was finally asking. And I wasn't there to answer. Something has to change. Something inside me has finally broken. I keep thinking about the security camera I installed a few years ago after that string of break-ins. It points toward the street, but it catches the edge of their driveway, their front steps. I never thought to look. I never wanted to be the nosy neighbor. But now I have to be. I have to know what happened that night. I have to find something that proves what I've known in my gut for years. I can't visit her. He's there, playing the devoted husband. But I talk to her from my kitchen table. I tell her I'm sorry. Do you remember when my mom was sick, Mare? You brought dinner over every night for a month. You mowed my lawn. You held my hand at the funeral. You were a sister to me. And when your monster came, I just watched from my window. I'd sit there, hearing a muffled shout, and I'd just pray for it to stop. I told myself I was helpless, that there was nothing I could do. That was the biggest lie of all. I could have called someone. I could have knocked on the door. I could have done anything but sit in silence. I was so happy for you when he moved in. He seemed so perfect. Too perfect. I remember that day you were planting roses, and he came out and criticized the way you were doing it. You laughed it off, but I saw the light in your eyes dim, just for a second. I should have known then. It started with the roses. Then it was the clothes you wore, the friends you saw, the person you were. I promised you I'd always be just over the fence if you needed anything. You looked at me with those big, trusting eyes and said, I know. I broke that promise. I stayed on my side of the fence while your whole world burned down. I spent the whole night making a list. Every time I saw a new, unexplained bruise, every time you canceled plans at the last minute, every time I heard his raised voice, the dates, the times, the excuses you gave me, the lies he told. It fills pages. It's a diary of your suffering, written by the friend who did nothing, a chronicle of my own cowardice. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, in an expensive suit, on the board of that women's shelter. The irony is sickening, and I let him hunt in my own backyard, but no more. It's time to use everything I saw, everything I ignored, to finally hold him accountable. It's time to tell the truth. I found the footage. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely use the mouse. It's from that night. It's grainy, dark, but it's there. I can see you two on the porch. I can see him grabbing your arm. I can see you pull away. It isn't clear enough to be a smoking gun, but it's enough to prove the accidental fall was a lie. It proves there was a fight. The relief was so overwhelming, I almost threw up. All these years, I was so afraid of what I might see. But seeing it, seeing proof that I wasn't crazy, it's a strange kind of hope. It's not just my word against his anymore. It's a start. He kissed me once, at that first barbecue. I told him I wasn't interested, and he just smiled and said he understood. For years, I told myself it was nothing, a simple misreading of signals. But it wasn't. It was a test, to see if I was a threat, to see if I would talk. And when I didn't, he knew I was safe. He knew I would stay quiet. The shame of that realization is a fire in my gut. I thought I was protecting my family, my peace, but all I was doing was helping him build your cage. I can't change that, but I can help tear it down. For you, for all the women like you. A detective came to my door this morning. A man named Webb. He looked tired, like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He asked if I had heard anything on the night of your fall. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment I had been dreading and praying for. The old me would have shaken my head, said I was sorry, and closed the door. But looking at him, I thought of you in that hospital bed. I thought of all my broken promises. I took a deep breath, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "More than that, officer. I saw something." I handed him the hard drive with the video. "You need to see this." The official story was that it was a closed case. I heard the whispers at the hospital, how Grant's powerful friends were making calls, shutting down any real investigation. But then Sloan found a detective, a man named Webb, who wasn't ready to let it go. He needed something solid, something that couldn't be buried by money or influence. I thought about the old phone Meredith had given me to hide months ago, after Grant had smashed her new one. She'd been too scared to get the data off it. I spent all night working on it, and then I found it. A video, shaky and dark, but his voice was clear, the threats unmistakable. I held the fragile thread of hope in my hand. I dialed the number Sloan had given me for the detective. "My name is Charlie Reeves," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. "I have something you need to see." That evening, I saw him return. His visit was a 30-minute performance of devotion for any potential audience. He held her hand, his grip a little too tight, his smile a cold, empty thing. Then he was gone. The weight of my silence felt heavier than ever. I watched Sloan follow him out, a shadow in his wake. Hours passed. She returned alone, her face a mask of despair. This was it. My chance to do something. I went into the room to check the monitors. Sloan was just sitting there, defeated. I moved to the bedside table. "Just tidying up," I murmured, and I picked up the patient belongings bag, placing it directly in front of her, right beside her hand. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. It was just a small gesture, but it was all I could do. It was my prayer that she would find what she needed to make them all listen. I remember the first time I saw her. She was parked across the street in a plain car, watching the house. An hour later, Mr. Grant came out with some younger fellow who looked like he'd seen a ghost. They shook hands, a fat envelope passed between them. Mr. Grant checked the contents, gave a little nod, and they both drove off. But she stayed, that woman, just sitting there thinking. I knew then he wasn't just a mean spirit. He was into something deep and dark, and she was here to dig it all up. Later, I heard whispers about what she found. Bank records, secret messages. It all pointed to what I'd suspected for years. Ashford Industries was a sham, billing the government for millions more than they spent. All that money, a fortune built on cheating, was hidden away in foreign banks. He wasn't just a bully, I thought to myself. He was a crook of the highest order. I saw her on the phone later, her voice urgent. She was trying to find someone honest at the SEC, someone money couldn't touch. She mentioned an old friend, a favor owed. When she hung up, I saw the light on in the guest house she'd rented, papers scattered everywhere, evidence of all his dirty work, all the pain he'd caused. He built this whole life on lies and cruelty, and I had a feeling she was about to pull the first stone and watch it all fall. The Ashford estate, my workplace for 30 years, is a fortress on 50 acres. Stone walls, iron gates, cameras watching your every move. The main house is a grand old place passed down through the family. It looks perfect, like a picture, but it's as cold and hard as the people inside. I was the one who led her up the path after she got the summons from Mrs. Ashford, his mother, the real boss, with a grip like iron covered in silk. I took her past the marble floors and the portraits of all the dead Ashfords. She was led into the sitting room, a place that cost more than my whole life. Mrs. Vivian was there on the couch, not a white hair out of place, pearls around her neck, a tea set ready. Miss Callahan, have a seat. But she just stood there. What do you want? The girl didn't waste time. Mrs. Vivian, smooth as ever, just poured the tea. Sugar? Milk? I'm not here for tea. No, she said, her voice like ice. You're here because you've been a nuisance. Upsetting my son. She put the teapot down, and her eyes were like chips of glass. I'm here to suggest you stop. And if I don't, then we will be forced to act. Our family has deep roots and many resources. Her smile was a threat. I'd hate for you to find out how deep. I saw the girl step closer, looking right down at the old woman. Your son put his pregnant wife in a coma. He's been hurting her for years, and you tell me to stop? Mrs. Vivian's face never flickered. Marriages can be challenging. That's a private matter. My son has never been violent. The doctors disagree. Evidence, she said, taking a sip of tea, is a matter of perspective. My son is a respected man, a leader. Your sister is lucky to be his wife. I could feel the girl's anger from the hallway. Lucky? She's in a coma. A terrible accident, Mrs. Vivian said, setting her cup down. You're no longer welcome, not in this house, this town, or my son's life. I advise you go back where you came from, before you regret staying. For a second, nobody breathed. The air was tight. I'm not going anywhere, the girl said, her voice low. And when I'm done, your son will be in jail. Your precious family name will be nothing but mud, and the whole world will know you raised a monster. She turned and walked right past me. From behind us, Mrs. Vivian's voice came, cold and sharp as a razor. You have no idea who you're messing with. I saw her find Mr. Theo later, at a bar in town. He was drunk, folded into a booth with an empty glass. He's nothing like his brother. Mr. Grant is all sharp angles and cold fury, but Theo is soft, broken. A man who's lived in a shadow his whole life. I watched from the street as she slid into the booth with him. Go away. I could read his lips through the window. Whatever it is, no. I just want to talk. About my brother, my poor sister-in-law? He gave a sad laugh. About what a coward I am. I know. You tried to help her once, she said, and I saw him freeze. His eyes locked on her. 3 years ago, she went on. You told Meredith to run. You offered to help, but Grant found out. Mr. Theo's voice was so low, I could barely see his lips move. He broke my arm, told everyone I fell from a horse. I haven't been near a horse in 15 years. I'm sorry. Don't be. I earned it. He tipped his glass back. I've watched my brother destroy people my whole life. Women, business partners, anyone in his path, and I did nothing. You were afraid. I'm still afraid. He looked at her, and his eyes were begging. He showed me photos last week of my children at their school. He didn't have to say a word. I felt a chill right through me. Mr. Grant wasn't just a monster. He was something worse, using children to keep everyone in line. "I need your help," she said. "I can't. He'll hurt my family. He'll keep hurting people unless someone stops him. Your sister-in-law is in a coma because nobody was brave enough." I saw Mr. Theo flinch. That's not fair. None of this is. But it's true. He sat there for a long time, the bar noise swirling around them. The sounds of normal people living normal lives. "What do you need?" he finally asked. "Tell me about the business, the doctored books, the fake companies." Mr. Theo looked like he was going to be sick. "How do you know that?" "I know a lot, but I need someone inside, someone who can tell me where to look." Another silence. Mr. Theo's hands were trembling. "There's a safe," he whispered, his voice faint. "In his office, behind the portrait of our grandfather. That's where he keeps the real books, the ones nobody is supposed to see." "Can you get me in? Are you crazy? That house is locked down tighter than a prison. There has to be a way." Mr. Theo just looked defeated. "There's a charity fundraiser next week. I remember the first time I saw it, at last year's summer party. The way his hand tightened on Meredith's arm, the smile that didn't reach his eyes. I told myself I was imagining things. Now, watching the sea of black ties at the estate, I know I wasn't. Then I see her, a woman with a purpose, talking to Theo from accounting. Something in his nod, a mix of terror and resolve, tells me this is it. This is the start of the storm. I think of Meredith's last words to me in the office. "Sisters forever," she'd said about the woman now walking into the lion's den. A knot of shame tightens in my gut. I should have done something sooner. The string quartet plays, but all I hear is the clock ticking, wondering if she's as brave as Meredith believed her to be. She wore a simple black dress, a shadow moving through the glittering crowd. She was invisible, and I envied her for it. I was stuck making small talk, watching Grant work the room. He was a master, playing the heartbroken husband for the Connecticut elite. Every handshake, every check he accepted for his charity felt like a personal insult. He was profiting from her pain, the very pain he'd caused. I watched him, and I felt sick, helpless. Then, as the main speech began, I saw her chance. She slipped through a side door, heading upstairs. Theo's whispered directions must have been good. I prayed she'd find what she was looking for, this ghost who had more courage than all of us put together. I waited for what felt like an eternity, sipping champagne I couldn't taste. It was less than 15 minutes later when she re-emerged, but her face was a mask of calm. Too calm. A few moments later, Grant himself walked down the grand staircase, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on her. He approached, his voice a low murmur I couldn't catch. He was all charm and smiles, but I'd seen that look before. It was the look he had right before he fired our entire department last year, the look of a predator that knows it has its prey trapped. My heart pounded for her. She just nodded and walked away, but he watched her go, a chilling satisfaction on his face. He didn't follow her again. He didn't have to. His message had been sent. I saw it in the slight tremor in her hands as she picked up a glass of water, in the way she kept her back to the wall. He had threatened her. I was sure of it. I'd heard whispers of what happened to people who crossed him. Tragic accidents, they were always called. His smile never faltered for the rest of the evening, a perfect, polished lie. As I left, I saw her standing by the valet, a small flash drive clutched in her hand. For the first time all night, I saw not just fear in her eyes, but a sliver of defiance. And for the first time in a year, I felt a flicker of something other than shame. Hope. That flash drive became a legend in the office whispers. We all knew she had something. We just didn't know what. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the video everyone was talking about. 32 seconds. That's how long they said he stood there, watching her at the bottom of the stairs. I remembered him announcing her pregnancy in a board meeting, beaming like the proud husband. The image was so grotesque now, so twisted. I'd watch him walk through the office, calm and in control, and I'd feel my stomach turn over. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, and we had all been too blind or too scared to see it. She saw it, though. She was trying to make us all see. The tremors started slowly. I saw her meeting with James Whitmore in the cafeteria. He was a good man, one of the few decent ones left on the board. After their talk, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Then the rumors of financial crimes began, of $23 million vanished into thin air. It was bigger than I ever imagined. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. We were all complicit, benefiting from a company built on stolen money and shattered lives. Grant's system seemed untouchable, a fortress of wealth and influence. But I had seen the look in her eye. She wasn't just throwing stones, she was laying siege. Then Paula Warren's name came up, then Linda Marsh's. I remembered them. Both sharp, talented women Grant had dismissed years ago, their careers torpedoed by rumors he'd started himself. He called them hysterical, unstable. Now they were back, and they weren't alone. They were talking to her. I saw them once, in a coffee shop downtown, three heads bent together in a tight circle. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about payback. The fortress was showing cracks. He had destroyed them one by one, but now they were standing together. I felt a surge of admiration so strong it almost choked me. They were doing what I had been too afraid to do. Detective Webb started showing up, a quiet, persistent man who didn't seem impressed by Grant's title. He'd ask questions, and people would clam up. I saw him talking to our head of security, a man I knew was on Grant's payroll. Files went missing, schedules were wiped. Grant's influence ran deep. A web of favors and threats that reached into every corner of the city. Webb looked tired every time I saw him, like a man trying to bail out the ocean with a bucket. We were all trapped in Grant's fortress, and I was starting to worry that even if we found the weak points, we were all running out of time. The news from the hospital was never good. Meredith was fading, and with her, the best chance of putting Grant away. The strain was showing on everyone who was helping her. I saw the exhaustion in their faces. Then I started noticing Nina Castillo, Grant's assistant. She was always quiet, but now she looked like a hunted animal. She knew where all the bodies were buried. She had to. I'd see her jump every time Grant's door opened. I knew that fear. It was the same fear that had kept my own mouth shut for so long. She held the keys to the kingdom, and I prayed she would find the courage to use them. They called it a suicide. No one in the office believed it, not for a second. We all knew Nina. She was a fighter. But we all went along with the story, offering our condolences and our fake sympathy. I saw Grant at the funeral, playing the role of the devastated boss. He looked so sincere. The performance was flawless. That's when my silence became a physical weight, something I could no longer carry. Nina had died because she was going to speak up, and I was still hiding in the shadows. She was braver than I ever was. The guilt was suffocating. It all started to crumble after that. The SEC investigation was buried in red tape. James Whitmore disappeared, his office cleaned out overnight. Theo sent me a single text. I'm sorry. The fear was working. Grant was winning. Then I remembered. An old server backup from a year ago. A project I worked on involving a shell company I was told to forget. An invoice I was told to shred. I hadn't. I'd copied the file to a personal drive, a tiny act of rebellion I'd long since forgotten. My hands were shaking, but I found the file, attached it to an anonymous email, and sent it to a journalist whose name I'd heard her mention. It wasn't much, but it wasn't silence. I saw what he did to the others. That journalist, Nina, I heard she had recordings of him from a long time ago. He got a hold of them, twisted them, and she lost her job. I should have known, I heard her crying to a friend on the phone. He always wins. One by one, everyone who was helping her just vanished. Then Mr. Grant paid her a visit himself. It was 9 at night. I was trimming the roses near the guest house and saw his car pull up. He stood at her door, dressed perfectly, with that cold smile of his. May I come in? No? Fine. He leaned on the doorframe. I'm offering you one last chance to go home. I'm not going anywhere. I figured, but a man can hope. He showed her his phone, and I could see pictures even from where I was. Photos of her everywhere, talking to people, meeting them in secret. You've been following me. I follow everyone, he said, putting the phone away. Here is what happens now. Tomorrow you will get on an airplane. You will go back to Seattle. And you will never speak to my wife again. Or what? Or unfortunate things will start to happen. To your business, your reputation, your friends. His smile got wider. I saw her step toward him. Are you threatening to kill me, like you did Nina? Nina took her own life. Everyone knows that. His eyes were like stones. Such a fragile girl. You're a monster. I am a successful man protecting his assets. He stood up straight. Your sister chose me years ago. She is mine. Nothing you do will change that. She's in a coma because of you. She fell, an accident. The police agree. The doctors agree. It's what everyone believes. He started to leave, then stopped. Go home, Sloan, before you have a tragic accident, too. He walked away into the night. She just stood there, shaking with a rage and fear so strong I could feel it from the garden. She locked the door, checked the windows, even slid a chair under the handle. Then, I think she just broke. The light went on in the bathroom, and I knew she was on the floor, letting it all out. For the first time, she looked beaten. It was 3 in the morning when I saw her light was still on. The weight of this place, of this family, it crushes people. Mr. Grant was too strong, too connected. He'd been getting away with it his whole life. Why would she be any different? Nina was gone. Mr. Theo was scared silent. The investigation was dead. All the women who were going to speak out had been ruined. Maybe he's right, I thought. Maybe she should just go home. I saw her pick up the phone, probably calling the hospital to check on her sister. The same news, I was sure, no change. But this time, I couldn't just stand by. I couldn't be a coward anymore. I took the spare key to the office, the one I wasn't supposed to have, and left it in an envelope on her doorstep. It all started the day I heard about Meredith's fall. I remember thinking about the last time I saw her at the company party, how her smile never quite reached her eyes. Hopeful, they said on the news. I clung to that word, but a cold guilt was already settling in my stomach. I'd seen the way Grant looked at her. I'd heard the whispers from other women in the office, women like Paula Warren, whose sobs I overheard in the restroom one day. I should have said something. I saw Nina Castillo's fear, too. We all did. But he was Grant Ashford, an untouchable force, and I was just an admin, afraid of losing my job. That fear felt like a stone in my chest. Then his sister-in-law, Sloan, started showing up. Watching her, I felt a different thought rise. What if I did nothing? What happens to the next woman he decides to break? The weight of my silence was unbearable. I couldn't just stand by anymore, not after seeing the promise in Sloan's eyes. A promise to make him answer for it all. I'd made promises to myself, too, to be brave, to speak up, but I was a coward. I watched Sloan from my desk. a silent ally. She never knew she had. Then, Nina was gone. An accident, they called it. I knew better. The day a courier delivered a package to Sloan, I saw the shift in her. The grief was still there, but now it was forged into something harder, something sharp. I later found out it was a flash drive from Nina. Her last desperate act of defiance. A voice memo she'd sent to a friend, played for me later, said, "I knew this would happen, but I had to do something right. Use this. Avenge us." That package was everything, Nina's final stand, and I felt a fresh wave of shame for my own inaction. It was a cache of secrets she had collected, proof of his darkness. For years, Nina had gathered his sins. I watched Sloan spend days locked away, listening, her face a mask of fury and sorrow. I could sometimes hear the recordings through her office door. Grant's voice, smooth and chilling, talking about burying complaints, buying off politicians, and laughing about how fear was his favorite tool. The worst was a recording from the night before Meredith's fall. Her talking to his brother, he'd said, "If she doesn't stop, I'll have to handle it." Then another voice asked what he meant. "Whatever it takes," he'd replied. "She belongs to me." That's when Sloan started talking to Paula Warren and the others. I saw them meeting in the break room, their fear slowly giving way to a fragile strength. She had proof now, she told them, the kind of proof he couldn't escape. 3 women became 4. Then 5, then 6. A small army of the broken, all ready to fight back. I heard Paula tell Sloan, "He's already taken everything from me. It's time we take something back." Detective Webb started visiting, his presence sending ripples of panic through the executive floor. I saw him listening to the recordings with Sloan, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like hope in his expression. "This is it," he'd said loud enough for me to overhear. Conspiracy, obstruction, maybe more. He couldn't arrest him just yet, but he was taking it to the new district attorney. The old one had resigned over some funding scandal. I knew that wasn't a coincidence. It was James Whitmore, quietly moving pieces on the board. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday. The agenda looked normal, but we all knew it was a trial. I watched Sloan prepare, making copies of everything: financials, audio files, sworn statements from 6 women, and a video I didn't know existed. She was building a cage of truth for him. The night before the meeting, I saw her leaving late, her face pale but determined. I knew she was going to the hospital to see Meredith. I imagined her sitting there, promising that it was almost over, that the world would finally see him for the monster he was. She was so brave, fighting for her sister, for all of us who were too scared. She was doing what I should have done. I felt a tiny shift inside me, a loosening of the fear that had held me captive for so long. Meredith tried to save herself. The least I could do was try to help. Then the news rippled through the office Wednesday morning. Meredith Ashford was awake. I saw Dr. Thornton hurrying down the hall, followed by nurses. It felt like a miracle, a sign. While she couldn't speak yet, her eyes were open. They said she was responsive. I saw Sloan go into the conference room they'd given her, and through the glass I saw her crying, but this time, the tears looked different. They looked like relief. Later, I overheard her on the phone, her voice thick with emotion. "She's tracking me with her eyes, Mara's back." Her lips moved, and I swear she said it. Sisters forever. The final piece had fallen into place. The board meeting was set for 9 the next morning. Grant Ashford would walk into that room at the head of the table, feeling untouchable, a king in his castle. He had no idea his kingdom was about to burn. "Before we start," James Whitmore said, his voice calm, "there's an urgent matter to discuss." The doors swung open. Sloan walked in, followed by Detective Webb, 2 uniformed officers, and the 6 women. I watched from my desk just outside the room. I saw the flash of confusion on Grant's face before his perfect, charming mask slipped back into place. What is this? This is private. Not anymore, Sloan said, placing a thick evidence packet in front of every board member. She laid out his crimes: 10 years of financial fraud, $23 million stolen. A low murmur filled the room. Then she listed the rest: conspiracy, obstruction, assault, and attempted murder. His voice was still like silk when he called it ridiculous, but I saw it. For the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. I remember the first time I saw the crack in their perfect facade. It was a lie I almost believed. Now, watching the news, I see it all again. They're showing a clip in the conference room. A video of him, her stepping back, the violence, the awful, deliberate pause, 32 seconds while she lay broken. Then, his staged call for an ambulance. The boardroom was horrified. I was just sick with guilt. I'd heard the shouting through the walls for years. His mask was gone, and he was screaming about doctored videos and entrapment. But the detective's voice cut through it all. The footage was from his own home security system, confirming years of a criminal pattern. Grant Ashford, the man next door, arrested for trying to murder his wife. "This is all wrong," Grant yelled as the officers came for him. And I watched from behind my curtains. "I am Grant Ashford. My friends are powerful people." He threatened their jobs, their entire careers. The detective just calmly told them to cuff him. The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place felt like the first quiet moment in years. They walked him past his colleagues, who refused to look at him, past the women he'd broken. He paused in front of his sister-in-law, Sloan, and whispered a threat. "This is not the end." I heard Sloan's calm reply on the news report. "I did what I promised. That was all." Then he was taken away. The story erupted everywhere. A CEO arrested for attempted murder. Ashford Industries stock collapsed. 6 more women were speaking out. The media descended like vultures. The story was just too unbelievable. They called him the Golden Boy of Connecticut, now exposed as a complete monster. I never saw the cameras. I just hid inside, haunted. My thoughts were only with Meredith. 3 days later, the news said she was awake, breathing on her own. Her voice was just a whisper, but she was telling her story at last. Detective Webb was gentle with her, letting her take her time. "He was so handsome at first," she'd said, her voice distant with the memory. "He made me feel like I was the only person on earth. I was stuck before I even knew I was in a cage. When did the violence start? It was slow, so slow I didn't see it. A jab here, a cruel word there. He cut her off from her family, her friends." She looked at her sister, her own sister. "Did you ever run?" "Yes, once. He found me. He promised he would change." Meredith's voice grew stronger then. "He changed for the worse. It always got worse." They asked about that night, and I saw her on the screen take a deep breath. "He was furious when he came home, accusing me of betraying business secrets to his brother." Her hand rested on her belly, where her baby was. "He struck me. I tried to get away, but he cornered me at the top of the stairs." "Did he push you down?" "Yes." The word was a ghost. "He grabbed my shoulders, stared right into my eyes, and he shoved me, and I fell." "That's enough for today," the detective said. The trial was set for 4 months later. In that time, Meredith had a baby girl, 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She was early, but she was a fighter. Meredith named her Hope. Not Hope Ashford, never his name. The trial was a media circus. The entire country tuned in. He pleaded not guilty. Of course he did. His defense team claimed it was a setup, fake evidence, a family grudge. But the proof was irrefutable. The tape, the money trail, and now the testimony of 8 women. 2 more had found the courage to come forward. Meredith took the stand on day 12. She wore a simple dress, plain and unadorned. She looked right at him. He smiled that cold, empty smile back, but his eyes looked hollowed out. She told them everything. 8 years of torment, of being controlled, of the terror that lived in her bones. I believed him when he said no one would help me, she said, her voice unwavering. I believed him when he said it was my fault. I believed him when he told me there was no way out. What was different this time? The lawyer asked. Meredith gazed at Sloan. My sister returned to me. She made me remember that I was never truly by myself. His lawyer tried to paint her as unstable, confused, a pawn in her sister's game. Meredith was solid as a rock. I know my own story. I know what he did. I have the scars. She locked eyes with Grant one last time. And I am done being afraid of you. The verdict was delivered on day 18. Guilty on every single charge. Attempted murder, 15 counts of fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. The sentence would be decided later, but he was facing up to 40 years. They let him out in chains. That smirk finally gone. Just a blank stare as his world turned to ash. I watched Sloan turn and embrace her sister. It's done, she said. It's really done. Meredith just held on, weeping. For the first time in years, those tears were from relief, not pain. 6 months after, Grant Ashford received his sentence. 40 years in prison without parole. During the hearing, 7 women he had victimized delivered statements. One after another, they stood before him and described everything he had stolen from them. Meredith spoke last. You said I was worthless without you, that I was lucky you even noticed me. Her voice filled the courtroom. You were wrong. I am not worthless. I am a survivor, and I will spend my life in freedom while you waste away in a prison cell. He never looked up. The judge handed down the maximum sentence. 40 years. It was a flawed, messy kind of justice, but it was justice. That night, I finally acted. I took the memory card from my own porch camera, the one that caught him calmly walking outside just after the fall, his face a mask of cold indifference, not panic. I put it in an envelope, addressed it to Detective Webb, and dropped it in a mailbox. No note, no name, just the truth. Vivian Ashford fled to Europe. The grand estate was sold, the money given to his victims. Not enough, but something. Theodore, his brother, went to counseling. He sent Meredith a note. I'm sorry I was a coward. I'm trying to be better. From my window, I watched Meredith and baby Hope move away to a new life in Seattle with Sloan. I saw them build their own little family, safe and sound. Sometimes, I imagined them on their new porch, watching the sun go down, the baby sleeping peacefully. I pictured Meredith saying, this isn't the life I planned for, a single mom at 33, still healing. What did you plan for? I can't even recall, she might have said with a small, real smile. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe the life I thought I wanted was always a cage. It was, but this one isn't. How can you be sure? Because you are finally free. You're safe, and you have a daughter who will see what true strength is. I pictured Sloan squeezing her hand. Because you have me, and I am never leaving you again. I hoped that was their reality. I saw on the news that Hope was 9 months old when she walked. Sloan was there. She was always there for her now. The baby wobbled across the floor, all determination and chubby legs. Meredith was on one side, Sloan on the other. Come on, sweet girl, you can do it. The baby smiled, showing off 4 little teeth, and took one more step before tumbling into Sloan's arms. She did it. Meredith was crying, but they were happy tears. Her first steps, she's going to be a real handful, Sloan proudly said, her heart full. I hope so, Meredith would have answered, scooping her daughter up. I want her to be a handful. I want her to be a fighter. I never want her to be silent. She won't be, not with us. I imagine them now, a family forged in fire. I used to think being strong meant never needing anyone, Meredith might say. But that isn't strength. That's just loneliness. What is it then? And she'd watch her daughter for a moment. It's letting people back in. Trusting, even after you've been shattered. Choosing to believe that love is worth the danger. Sloan might ask if she regrets the 6 years they lost. Every single day. Meredith would say, but all I can do now is build a better life. For Hope. For me. For us. Sisters. Always. My one small act of sending that tape can't erase my years of silence. But watching their new beginning on the news, I finally feel a little bit of my own hope returning. I still remember the first time I saw it. Sunlight pouring through my bedroom window. The same way it is now. I must have been 8, maybe 9. The birds were singing, just like today. A perfect Seattle morning. But across the lawn, in their house, the peace was broken. I saw him yelling, his face twisted, and I saw Sloan, so small, pull her little sister Meredith behind her. I just stood there, a toy in my hand, watching through the glass. That image is burned into my memory, the beginning of a silence I kept for far too long. For years, I watched the shadows in that house grow, and I did nothing. I was just the kid next door, a ghost in their story, carrying a weight I couldn't name. I saw Meredith grow up with a sadness in her eyes that never quite left. I'd see Sloan checking on her, a fierce, protective light about her even then. They moved away, and I grew up too, but the guilt followed me. I'd wonder what happened, if they were okay, if my voice could have made a difference. I was paralyzed by the thought that it was not my place, not my story to tell. But inaction is a choice, and mine was cowardice. I was so ashamed of the friend I hadn't been to them, the neighbor who just pulled the curtain shut. I saw Meredith once, years later, with her baby, Hope. The fear was still there, a ghost in her features, and I knew their father was still a threat. That night, I couldn't sleep. The little boy at the window, frozen in fear, was still inside me, but he wasn't a boy anymore. I thought about that day, 24 years ago, and all the days after. I remembered something else, a letter Sloan had slipped under my door once, begging me to tell my parents what I saw. I'd hidden it, terrified. I found it last night, tucked away in an old shoebox. His threats, her fear, all in a child's handwriting. This was it. Not silence, but a voice. This was how the healing could start. It wasn't the absence of my fear, but the presence of a conviction that their safety mattered more. My hand shook as I scanned the letter. My small, decades-late promise to protect them. I sent the scan to the authorities in an anonymous email, my heart pounding with every click. It might be exactly what someone needs to finally be heard. I'm sharing this because your story matters. Your voice has power, even if it feels small. Please don't wait like I did. This content is my own story, my confession, edited by years of regret, but shared with the hope that it helps someone else find their courage. It's my way of turning a painful memory into a lesson. Thank you for letting me share this, for listening to a silent witness who finally decided to speak. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.